I'm author and critic David Agranoff. I'm a horror and science fiction author, critic, and researcher. In this podcast, I wanted to provide in-depth interviews and panel discussions with everyone from New York Times bestselling authors to researchers, musicians, and anyone I find interesting. Welcome to Postcards from a Dying World. Hello and welcome to another episode of Postcards from a Dying World. I am very excited to have my return guest, Philip Fracassi, on to talk about his novel, The Third Rule of Time Travel. But before I do that, really quickly, on the Monday that this comes out, we have a new thing we're doing through the Dickheads podcast, which is we have Tuesday night live Philip K. Dick Hangouts. And we're going to do interviews for the podcast that you can be a part of. You can join and ask questions. And this past week, we had Alec Neville Ali, the author of Astounding, to talk about researching science fiction. And the week before, we had Dan Annabella from the Philip K. Dick Film Festival on. And some future things we've got going on. We got Ray Naylor coming up on the Dick Hangout to talk about Mountain in the Sea and his new novel, Where the Axe is Buried. And Senya Paleo, who was just on this podcast a week ago, will be coming on to talk about the influence of Ubik on her new novel, Vanishing Daughters. So we got a lot of cool stuff coming up. In the near future, we're going to have Stephen Graham Jones, John Shirley, Lisa Morton, all kinds of fun guests coming up live on Tuesday nights. So you can join us at the Dick Hangout. The second hour, we just talk and BS about science fiction. If you want to hang around for that, you can, but it gets into some pretty nitty gritty, nerdy stuff where we talk about where Phil was on particular nights and stuff. So I don't recommend that for everybody. That's for the hardcore scholars. So every Tuesday night, 6 o'clock Pacific time, 9 o'clock Eastern. You can join us, follow the Dickhead podcast feeds for Zoom links, and please join us for that. And then eventually the interviews will end up in the podcast feed. But if you want to be part of the questions and answers and all that, you can join us. All right, Philip, welcome back. Last time we had you on, we were talking about your horror novel, Boys in the Valley. Now, once again, your novel cracked my top reads of the year, this time being The Third Rule of Time Travel. Now, as a Detroit Lions fan, I will have you know that when I read The Third Rule of Time Travel, I was traveling back from BizarroCon in Oregon, and my flight from Portland to San Diego, I watched the Lions come back and beat the Arizona Cardinals on Sunday Night Football. So
Sweet.
I was very connected to you because I was feeling the flow of the comeback that night. Well, I read the first 150 pages of this book. So
That's great. It's perfect.
Yeah. And I just wanted you to know, like, I really felt connected to you during that read. So the last time you were on, you hinted at this novel and you talked a little bit about it. So some of our listeners might remember that conversation, but why don't you give everybody a brief introduction into The Third Rule of Time Travel and how this book came about?
Yeah. So, I just had the idea of I think I read a lot of I wouldn't say a lot, but I actively read science, physics books. I love reading books by Brian Greene and Michio Kaku, and I've read Kip Thorne and Carl Sagan, and I don't remember what exactly sparked the initial idea, but I remember the idea being that of consciousness being digitized and traveling through time, through a wormhole in space time. And because with my time machine, as one knows, with wormholes, you cannot put matter through a wormhole. But you could put theoretically you could put data through a wormhole. And so so anyway, so that idea kind of hit me, and I started sort of building around it. I started building this world around this science, time travel, you know, idea. And and so yeah, Beth, kind of sprang to mind, and the idea that she had a daughter, and then I kind of the idea that there'd be sort of butterfly effect in that idea that she worked for like an overbearing corporate entity who's constantly trying to mess with her and take control of her science. And so yeah, it all kind of built from there. And I originally, this was originally called Observe, and it was originally written it as a screenplay for a film. And a few years after that, I started getting a little bit more traction with my fiction. And so I decided to adapt my own screenplay into a novel, and did quite a few things, changed quite a few things as one does. But yeah, so then that was the novel, and it was still called Observe right up until the time that I sold it to Orbit. And then they wanted to change the title to The Third Rule of Time Travel. So that's, which I thought was a much cooler title.
It is a great
So
title. I think
yeah.
I want to say that is a great title.
Well,
It
it was funny
immediately is
because they
intriguing.
told me they wanted to change the title, and I was like, guys, look, it's got to be called Observe. Like, if you read the book, you'll know why I'm saying that. It's inherently tied into the structure of the story, and so I kind of made a little bit of a stink about it. I was like, guys, it's got to be called Observe. It's the only title that works. And they're like, well, let us just think about it and brainstorm and get back to you. And so I saw my editor, my UK editor, um, when I was over there for the British Fantasy Awards last year, and I said, "Hey, what's this new title you guys are thinking about? Nobody will tell me." And she said, "The Third Rule of Time Travel." And I said, "Oh yeah, that's better. Let's go with that." So, and in
Yeah.
this case, the publisher was actually correct.
Well, as a Phil Dickian, his titles that he had were terrible always. It's a running
Right.
joke on our podcast.
So funny.
Is yes, very rarely did he have a title that was working in the beginning. So, and he gets a lot of credit for like these amazing titles that he has, but a lot of them were Don Wollheim at Ace.
Oh,
Like,
right.
you know, but so sometimes somebody on the outside can look and say like, oh, this is a
Yeah.
better title.
This is the only book or story of mine that's ever been changed. So,
Mhm.
including the upcoming novels. So, so normally I'm pretty resistant to it, but I actually thought this one was a pretty good. I think it's a much. I think Observe is a more fitting title, but I think the Third Rule of Time Travel is a more more marketable title, and I think it'll get more people to pick up the book and read it, which is the ultimate goal. So,
Well, and also I do think thematically that third rule is a very important part of the
right,
story. So
great, and it ties into the Observe element, so it was all
yeah,
good.
yes, and I don't think it takes away from it in any way. Um, and but yeah, that's great that they did that. So let's talk about these aren't quite Asimov's rules of robotics, but you've got like these the three rules. How early in the process were these rules a part of the story? Because I kind of love that the three kind of puts them in like a kind of conversation with the three rules of robotics and science fiction. That was one of the things I liked about that.
Yeah, the rules thing came around because it's all another thing that I've always been a big nerd about is the double slit experiment.
Mhm.
The idea that when protons are observed, they act differently than when they're not observed by the human. And if you take Neil deGrasse Tyson, he has his perspective on that is like he kind of laughs at the idea that some people think it's mystical or supernatural versus just like hard science. But there are some theoretical physicists that cannot explain it. And so it kind of depends, but from a pure imagination perspective, I thought it was very cool that particles would act differently when they were observed, and but not obviously so. And so one of the rules of time travel in in Beth Beth's world is that the traveler can only observe, and the whole point of that is that they believe that by only observing, you cannot step on a butterfly, you cannot kill your grandfather because you have no control over what's happening when you visit the past. The first rule, of course, is that the traveler, can only travel to a point in their own lifetime. The second rule being they can only be there for 90 seconds, and the third being they can only observe. And so the idea that it plays into the idea that science cannot be harnessed, and that we are so ignorant of so many things. That's an overriding theme in the book, is how humankind feels like it's so smart, but we're actually incredibly ignorant of so much. And so the idea of playing with something more powerful than they realized, and not understanding how it would actually affect reality, was something that I wanted to play with. So I had that idea that, like, we can only observe. That's got to be stated in the book. And then I was kind of like, I should just make like a set of rules, and that's one of the rules, and that's kind of how the three rules came about.
Right. And one of the kind of really neat things that as a writer comes up, like when you set yourself like these are the rules, these are the parameters that you have, then it becomes a fun exercise to work within the rules that you've laid down for it, and to develop, make sure that the story fits into to those parameters. So
Right.
I'm sure
And then
that
to
was very
break
fun.
those rules is the ultimate
Yeah.
gag.
Yeah.
Right.
How do you break the rules and say these rules cannot be broken? Exactly. And
Right.
then,
Right. Right.
yeah, which is, the game that Asimov was playing so long with the three laws of robotics, which is, yeah. Now I'm wondering, do you have favorite time travel stories that were an influence on you, or ones that were maybe even an influence of, like, I hated that time travel story and I don't want to do that? Either way.
No, I mean, I think I don't. Interestingly, I don't think I was really that inspired by other time travel stories for this novel. I was more inspired by the idea of, um, I was more inspired by the science of it, or the theoretical physics of it, or the quantum mechanics of it. I was inspired by this, by the idea of building this time machine. But I wasn't really thinking about like the H.G. Wells or the other, you know, 495 million time travel stories that came before this one. So no, there wasn't anything particular I'd point to. It was really something that I felt was um unique. I thought it was something that I had not read before. Doesn't mean it's not out there, um but I had never read it. I felt like I was creating something original, which I think if you're writing a time travel novel, you want it to be a variation of time travel that has not been explored yet. And so this I thought was something new. Um, and it's also, at least theoretically, um, sound. I mean, the science is technically correct. It's just a matter of, um, having, like, we can't harness negative energy, obviously, and how, creating a wormhole for a sustained period of time. That was the 90 seconds thing, was how much energy would it take to sustain a wormhole for a period of time. But so it is it, but the idea that you can travel to visit your own past, and send your consciousness to your own past is a little more theoretically, sound than, say, going back to visit the dinosaurs, or going forward 100 years into the future. So
Mhm.
even though it bends speculative toward the tail end of the book, um I did try very hard to keep the science as grounded as possible. I actually had, when I was able to, before I wrote the story, I just had the idea, and I was able to see a live Q&A Zoom with Michio Kaku. And at the end of the Zoom, they said if anyone has questions, they can ask questions, and Michio Kaku will answer them. And so I asked the question. I said, if you were able to, create a machine that opened a wormhole, could you theoretically and digitize someone's consciousness, could you theoretically send data through the wormhole without it collapsing? And he answered the question live, and he was like, yes, as long as if there's just data, the answer would be yes. So that was a big win for me early on, and it inspired me to kind of like dig in and finish that story. So yeah, so anyway, it's the
I
science
think
part
I
of it is
saw
really
that
fun.
clip. I think you may have posted it or
I I did.
something.
I posted it when it happened. Yeah, it was pretty
Yeah.
exciting. And there's other science too, like with the way the questions are sent to, faster than the speed of light to satellites and then beam back to Earth, so they're technically ahead of real Earth time, and the whole inverse square law and all that kind of stuff is all that stuff is stuff that I researched. I even had a NASA physicist read through the book and offer advice and question, and feedback. So the science of it's really fun, even though in the story it's kind of a minor
Yeah.
part or minor element, but it was very important to me that it be as right as I could possibly make it.
Yeah, I had a similar situation with my novel "Goddamn Killing Machines." I originally had a scene where characters were skydiving on Mars,
Hmm.
and I asked Fraser Kane, the editor of Universe Today, about skydiving on Mars, and he basically talked me out of that scene because it would be really boring skydiving on Mars. It was
Right. So
the
slowly.
yeah, it'd be very slow. And then
Yeah.
I ended up cutting that chapter completely. So I was like, it is a very similar situation. But
Yeah.
so one of the things too about, and we'll get into nitty gritties of the story later with a spoiler warning, but for now, to just stay kind of general on it. Well, one thing too is we want to promote the fact that you're going on tour. Do you have and I know you're going to be here in San Diego on the 22nd at Mysterious Galaxy.
Yeah.
Um, and so, what are some tour dates that we can give out before we go deeper into
Yeah.
this?
I'm doing a very limited tour for this book. The primary reason for that is because I have another book coming out in September with Tor Nightfire, um, called The Autumn Springs Retirement Home Massacre.
Mhm.
And that's a horror book, which is sort of what I'm more known for. So I kind of could only put my I can only put my, money into doing one or the other. So I kind of had to pick one. So I'm gonna put my money into doing the other one. Um, but for Third World Time Travel, I'm gonna be doing a launch event here in Los Angeles, where I live, on the 19th of March at Village Well in Culver City. And then I'm going to be doing Mysterious Galaxy on Saturday, the 22nd. And then I'm going to be doing Artifact Books in Encinitas, which is just, less than an hour away from Mysterious
Mhm.
Galaxy, um, on Sunday the 23rd. So, and then I'm also going to be at AuthorCon 5, March 28th to March 30th, and I'll have copies there, and I'll be signing copies there. Oh, and then I'm going to be at Books in the Bosque in Albuquerque, New Mexico on April 12th. And
And
that's it for this
both
tour.
Artifact and Mysterious Galaxy will ship if you want to buy a
Right.
signed copy forever. And if you do it between now and when Philip's there, you can probably get it personalized.
Yep.
And shout out to both stores. We're big fans of. Greg from Artifact has been on this podcast.
Oh,
So
cool.
during the Science Fiction Hall of Fame series. So big fans. And so yeah, and as long as everything goes as planned, I'll be at Mysterious Galaxy on the 22nd.
Oh, I hope you will come, because I did an event at Mysterious Galaxy for Boys in the Valley, and 3 people showed up.
And
So
I was
I'm
one of
hoping. I
them.
know, I know. So I'm hoping to
I'm
draw more
working.
people for this one.
Hey, I made a fan of this novel out of a coworker who I passed the
Good.
arc on to, who's very active on Goodreads. So I,
Oh, good.
as long as you keep the ball rolling, I think this
Well,
book
the other thing with my last Mysterious Galaxy event, and they were great. They promoted it and everything, was nothing, but I think it was a Friday night, and it was like 6 o'clock on a Friday, and I think
it was a
that was
tough time. Yeah.
that's a tough time. So when we did this event, I said, can we please do it on a Saturday, hoping that I'll get a few more people to come.
Yeah,
And
I knew a couple of people that had really wanted to go and just
yeah,
were afraid of the traffic of that Friday
yeah,
event. So hopefully we'll have a better
I did end
turnout.
up signing. I think they had
Hey,
like
now,
30 pre-orders, and I signed, so that was good. But it was
yeah,
just the
well,
people.
and I will tell you, I learned a valuable lesson. I know I say this all the time, but I went to Clive Barker signing in Orange County once where there were four of us.
Yeah,
And Clive treated us like we were all royalty, and it taught me a big lesson because before he walked in, I was really embarrassed that there was only four people there, and I felt terrible. And
yeah,
then he came in with this great attitude and like, "Hey, you four people are awesome.
you
Let's have a
have
good
to.
time."
Yeah,
And
you have to.
I it taught me a big lesson, about
Yeah, I don't mind that. I mean, I don't mind, I did for Boys in the Valley, I did like 30 stores, and I would do a little store in Arkansas and 40 people would be there. And then I would do a mysterious bookstore in New York City, which I thought would be so much bigger, and like
right.
five people showed up. So, but yeah, to that point, I'm never concerned about, like, I'm always happy to meet people and meet readers and answer questions and sign
Absolutely.
books. But I feel bad for the I feel like I let the bookstore down when nobody shows, because they put on this event, and then I always feel bad for the
Yeah.
bookstore. So that's the part that's awkward and embarrassing, is like you feel bad for you feel like the bookstore's never going to want you there again, and that you try to so I try and avoid that if I can.
Yeah, well, yeah, no, I remember you signing a lot of copies, so I think a lot of San Diegans
Yeah,
bought it.
and I'll have some Boys in the Valley. I'm hoping they'll have Boys in the Valley there as well, the new paperback. So I'll be able to sign
Yeah,
those too for people.
absolutely. So we'll see folks out there on the 22nd.
Yeah,
Um, so and another thing before we get into nitty gritty on spoilers, like I don't know because I know Matheson is a huge influence, and I compared this novel in tone to a Matheson novel, partially because I
that's a
think
huge
that
compliment. Thank you. I'm a monster Matheson fan, so that's
right.
nice to hear. Yeah,
So let me explain why I think this is very Matheson novel.
please. Yeah,
There is an emotional core to the novel. That's one thing. And the balance between wanting to get the science right and the emotional core are the things that a lot of people will miss about why I think it's a Matheson novel. Because a lot of times people will say, well, they don't really think of Matheson as being like a big science guy. But remember, the whole basis of I Am Legend was that he wanted a scientific basis for all the things that made a vampire a vampire was a huge part of that. You have the researchers in Hell House. There's a lot of examples of where Matheson, like in his mind, wanted everything to make sense and to work. Now he
yeah,
did get fantastical with Somewhere in Time, which is his time travel novel, right?
right.
Because in the end, I don't think he like thought there was a legit way to send his character back there without just making it fantastical. That being said, it's that emotional core of this story, and one of the things that I think people, you'll talk a lot about the time travel part, but Beth and Colson, right? Is that
Yeah.
I read this in November, so it's been a couple months since I
Well,
read
I
it.
wrote it in 2022, so you're doing better than me.
Yeah. So you know, the emotional core of their kind of tragedy and what drives them to want to go back to the past or observe the past, and that
Right,
trauma for story reasons is a huge part of the story, and it
right.
drives some things that I think we'll get into in spoilers. But I think the emotional resonance of this novel is something that might get lost in the discussion of the time travel and the science of it, and I just want to make sure that we put it out there that this book is very deeply emotional for the characters. So I don't know if you
Yeah.
have a comment on that, but
Yeah, I mean, it's very important to me with all of my novels that there's that balance. Specifically, like, I've written a couple stories. I have a novel called Serafina that came out in a limited edition from Earthling, and next in 2026, and next April, it's going to come out in a trade edition from Clash Books, and that's historical fiction. It's Civil War horror, and very similarly, and Boys in the Valley is an example of historical horror. Very similarly to Third World Time Travel, it was very important to me to be as correct as I could be with the historical elements, while also engaging the emotional core of the story of the characters for the reader to connect with. So it is a balance, but it's very, very important to me to have. I mean, number one priority is to always have that emotional that what I that reader connection element, what I call it, that emotional connection, or that empathetic connection, where the reader can empathize with what's happening. They understand it, they get it, they've been there, they
Mm,
understand what the characters are going through. All you want the reader to really connect with your characters so that they feel more involved in the story, and enjoy the story more. And even like with Boys in the Valley, there's a lot of emotion in that story, even though it's technically just like, a possession horror story. Serafina, it's really about family. And like I know, like I mentioned, Autumn Springs Retirement Home Massacre is a slasher, but it's got a lot of the character Rose Dubois, the main character in that book, is like somebody that I really felt strongly about. And there's a lot about like aging, and how it affects our children, and how it affects people when they get older, and their decisions they make, their life decisions, and the relationships, and trust, and all that stuff. So it's really important for me to always have that very human side of anything that I write. And that's the part that really drives me as a writer. That's the part I find the most exciting,
mm.
is um, creating that like human element, that the reader hopefully will connect with. And then all the horror and sci-fi and all that kind of stuff is just like frosting to me. And it's a way to tell the
Yeah.
story about these people. And so yeah, I'm really happy you said that. It makes me feel very good, because
Well,
that's really it's
you
it's
know,
about it's really about Beth and loss
mhm.
and grief and all that stuff. But it's also
Well,
about
I
time
was
travel.
just explaining like the first episode of that new season of Daredevil. There's this crazy action sequence that starts off the episode that's like 15
Mhm.
minutes long, almost one shot. But the scene at the diner between Kingpin and Murdoch and Matt, like sitting like talking, is way more intense
Yeah.
than that entire action scene, because the tension between the two characters is like super intense. And
Yeah, it's
this,
like that scene in Heat.
yeah.
It's like you'd think everybody would always talk about this scene that takes place in downtown Los Angeles during the bank heist, right? The shootout. But
Mm.
actually, the scene that people always remember about that movie is De Niro and Al. What's the other guy's name?
Pacino.
Pacino. Thank you. I was going to say Capone. Um, Al Pacino sitting at a table talking for like 20 minutes. So yeah, I definitely think it's a balance, but it's always a balance. But I think that's true. You want to build characters that readers are like really connected to, and that empathize with, um and that makes the ultimately make the story that much better.
And I don't think this is a heavy spoiler because I think this is on the description of the novel, but Beth and Colson are driven, and because in part because they lost their daughter Isabella in a car accident. And you know
No, that's not correct.
okay.
You're misremembering. Colson, this is not a spoiler, I don't think,
Okay.
folks. This is not a spoiler, but it Colson dies in the car accident.
Oh, Colson, that's right,
The
because she's
husband
with
dies.
the
Yeah,
with the daughter. Yeah.
we won't talk about the daughter, I don't think, until we get into spoiler territory.
Yeah.
But Colson is the one who died. Yeah, he's at the beginning of the book. He's already dead, folks. So it's fine.
Yeah.
Beth is it's a year later after his death when the book starts.
Okay, I didn't you're right, because I did read it. I did read this in November, so
No,
and
it's okay.
we're in
But
March
yeah, I didn't
now.
want. Yeah, but that's the setup with, and that's why Beth is sort of left with this giant project on her own, because her and Colson were also, they were married,
Right.
but they were also a team that developed the science and the machine.
Mm,
And so she's dealing with the grief of her husband while also trying to continue their work. It's a lot of stress for her, and raise their daughter.
right. Yeah, and so what I would say to people is that there is the fun science of this. There is the cool. For me, it was fun to see an author who's primarily known for writing horror, write a science fiction novel, and you're right. One of the big pluses for this book, or one of the things when people have asked me, just the other day, my buddy Anthony asked me, "Oh yeah, you read Fraccassi's new book? What's it about?" And I said, Oh, it's a real original take on time travel. That was the way I sold it to him. I said it's just a real original take on time travel, and you'll want to read it. It's very Matheson-esque. That was my pitch to him.
I, yeah, that's great.
And I think you know that's the way I put it forward. Now, before we get into spoilers, you know, are, is there any other things you want to point people to, like things you want them to see? They want, you know, make sure they check you out on tour and all that. We've already gone through that. Before we get into the nuts and bolts of this novel.
No, I don't think so. I mean, I think there's always, anyone who's interested in who's going to tune out for the spoiler part of the conversation, you can always get more information about the tour dates and where to get signed copies and stuff like that. You can find me on Facebook, or Blue Sky, or Instagram, or my website is pfracassi.com. So those are all the best places to find me if you're looking for more info. If you're going to tune out the rest of this podcast,
Yeah.
which is,
Well,
I don't
here
want to.
the other thing you can do, you can just hit pause on this and go
Right.
order the book and
There you
come
go.
back
Come back and listen to it. Yeah.
and then listen to it.
Yep.
So join us
And
back.
the book comes out in less than 10 days, so it's not a long wait. Well, I don't know
That was funny because
whenever this airs, it'll be probably even less than time than that.
I had somebody recently tell me that they listened to the first half of my Ray Naylor interview on Mountain and the Sea,
Oh yeah.
and then read it a year and a half later and
Oh
went
funny.
back. They were like, "Well, I guess I should just start the whole podcast over."
Oh
and,
funny.
and they said it was still in their podcatcher, saved in the same spot,
Oh, right on.
which is funny. Yeah, and actually, that's a good comparison too. Is for those who are fans of Naylor's Mountain in the Sea, which is a fantastic book about octopus intelligence and AI and all that. It's also a very similar. So if you like that one, Third World Time Travel is also kind of in the same, like, kind of emotional core, talking about, you know, like real smart science fiction that takes the science seriously. So that's another good comparison. So on that note, all right, we're gonna get into spoilers, and the first thing that I have is Beth pointing out and saying, "Remember, I am the time machine." I
Yeah.
love the concept of when she says, the machine is a conduit, a doorway, an expansion of the hippocampus. So now I can travel outside of my own memories, in my own timeline. It's not just possible theoretically or otherwise, since it's my consciousness through the wormhole. I can only travel where I existed. So
Right.
part of the idea is this digitizing of consciousness, but it's that your mind is the time machine itself, which is
Right.
actually really good way to get around the idea that, one of the things that always John Shirley and I talk about this all the time. The hard part with time travel, and we're like, oh, I'm going to go back to 1800 in my
Right.
time machine, but of course the Earth would be in a completely different spot in orbit
Right.
and in space and time, and it just breaks the brain when you start thinking
Yeah.
about that. So her being the time machine kind of gets around that. So can you talk to me about this whole concept of her being the time machine itself?
Yeah, so I definitely, that was not interesting to me, the idea that I was going to build a time machine that could go back to the dinosaurs and stuff like that. I end up breaking my own rule in the book later, but with intention. But yeah, so the idea that like when Beth is being interviewed by the reporter, and she says the reporter says, I want to see the time machine, and Beth says, you're looking at it. Yeah, the
Yeah.
idea is that it is the traveler, uh you kind of said it really well, which is the traveler is basically going to a point in their own existence, and they're supposedly controlling that that destination. And one of the things I play with in the book, which is the whole universe pushing back against science element, the Tower of Babel element, is that they actually don't know what controls where the traveler's consciousness lands in
And
their
that
timeline.
the trauma, it acts like a magnet to
Right.
pull your mind through to some of the most horrible moments in your
Yeah,
memory. Yeah.
right. And I play with that a little bit, and it's interesting if you reread the book. There's a part where there's a conversation between Beth and the psychologist where Jonathan, where um he's saying, why do you keep traveling to these traumatic moments? The worst thing that Colson ever traveled to was a breakfast where where he's eating making pancakes for the family, and which ends up being tying in to the end of the end of the story, end of the book, where that moment actually is recreated. Um,
And we're in
but yeah,
spoilers, so you can fly on those too. So
okay. Well, I'm gentle spoilers. So anyway, so the idea that the idea with Beth, with Beth saying that is obviously there's science involved. Obviously there's tremendous amounts of energy involved. Obviously they're still creating the wormhole. Obviously they're using quantum computers to digitize consciousness but and send that consciousness through the wormhole to her past. But ultimately the time machine is all about the person who's traveling, and that it's their existence that drives where the destination points. It can't be outside of their own existence and to that date theoretically. And that's one of the things that when Jim Langan um when he's one of the things that he's threatening Beth with, and one of the reasons he wants the control of the technology is because he wants to see if he can figure out a way to put people's consciousness into different people. The idea of what if I could put a traveler's consciousness into Hitler's brain, or into um, somebody else, some key historical figure, and change the way they act in some way. So that's kind of the idea that. But yes, that's why Beth says that, and that's why that control element, if you will, the scientific control element it's got to be part of that person's lifetime, whether whoever's consciousness is traveling, that's basically the map from which the destination can be chosen. It can't be outside that map.
yeah, and this and Colson dying in the accident. Now I remember I'm remembering it
Yeah.
correctly. He kind of starts. Then we get the idea that there's some time travel shenanigans happening that's outside of what we know early on in the book, because
Right.
the dead father is kind of starting to appear in different situations. And this is where your strength as a horror writer comes in, because the Colson appearing, and like um, Beth not believing Isabella in the beginning. Excellent scenes. Very well done. And a part of the book that as we're talking about it, it's coming back to me very strongly. Again, I was reading it on that flight back from Portland,
Yeah.
and my favorite time to read is when I'm traveling, because I'm stuck in the seat, so I got nothing better to
Right.
do, and I can't get up. And I remember I have a very distinct memory of reading one of those scenes while I was at the gate waiting to get on, and almost didn't hear my boarding call.
Yeah.
So very good stuff. So tell me about like this Colson ghost thing. Like, how early did that come into the process? Was that
Um, I don't I don't remember exactly. I think what it was, I think honestly, because originally I wasn't planning on having strong speculative elements in the story. I was pretty much, if I remember again correctly, this is a few years back now, but I remember I was
I
thinking
don't
of it
think
as
it's
as
that deep.
no, well, I mean, as far as like the fact that is basically exists
Yeah.
outside of time, and he based and at the end um when she finds him, because also she ends up being pushed out of time as well, because of the shenanigans that take place while
Yeah.
during her last travel session.
Yeah.
And so basically the idea is there's this corner this and that conversation is very a big part of the book, because he's basically saying there's so much we don't understand about the universe, and this machine is basically was like a gateway to something that's too big for human comprehension, and humans could theoretically travel wherever they wanted because there's infinite dimension. You can skip to another dimension if you only know how to do it and have a different reality. And I
Mhm.
think it gets into that play, um, but
And
what I
that
like,
scene's great because as the reader, we
this,
don't entirely know what's happening yet. And
right,
so when we don't know if they accidentally sent part of him back in time and he's going to start, you know, haunting the as especially as storytellers, we start going on our own tangents, right?
right.
And I remember just he stands right there and Beth just not being able to handle it. It's just A plus.
I call it the space meadow scene, but
Yeah,
yeah, and but the idea of like the ghost, there's also the idea of waves of time and those waves overlapping. Like if you think of a wave coming in on the beach and kind of like receding back out, it leaves like that residue that slowly leaks, that recedes even slower than the initial wave, right? There's that kind of like
yeah,
it's that first wave that recedes, and there's the kind of like second layer of water that kind of goes back more slowly. And in my book, I kind of think of time acting that way. So if you change time, that first wave hits and then it goes back, and then there's that second wave that sort of slowly goes back. And that was the way I thought of time, and Beth's reality. That's why when there's the scene where she's kind of like where she's seeing herself and Coulson, you know, and she sees Isabella after Isabella has left this, after she's
yeah,
changed that reality, because there's still that residue of the old reality that's sort of still seeping in. So that's why Beth is seeing Coulson here and there, and then Coulson also is basically, he's like this outsider who's still traveling, trying to get it right and trying to warn Beth to stop doing what she's doing because he doesn't want her to screw up her own life, which is the whole scene with when he tries to sabotage the machine. That's why he's doing it. And then the ending of the story is basically Coulson finally figuring it out. And it's less about them getting it right and more about them all finding a happy reality where they all exist and everything is good. And then Coulson makes that decision to not go into the lab on that Sunday, Beth's birthday, which is the day that he died. And so the hope is that in this reality they live happily ever after. But that was the idea with Coulson's ghost, is that he is outside of this reality, because he's already been killed in this reality. But the idea that because he's been traveling, he can now communicate with other realities and sort of come back and visit Beth, as it were, and visit Isabella, as it were, because he's sort of warping reality, and Beth ends up learning how to do that as well.
oh,
That's where it
absolutely,
gets more. That's where it gets more speculative. And that is where the hard science stops and the speculative imagination begins. But again, it's all the main thing is like the fact that no matter how much you think there's they always that diagram of the iceberg, where you see this much above the waterline and they show the whole thing beneath it. It's kind of like the inverse of that. It's like, oh, we've learned how to time travel and we're just seeing this little bit, and there's so much more that we don't know about. Um, that's I found that really fascinating because we're so ignorant of the universe, and we literally don't understand anything about the universe, for even though we have a million books about it and a million as teachers and scientists and physicists and all this stuff. The reality is we don't know anything. We don't know anything. The universe is this giant mystery. No one knows how it really came to exist, if what it was before we existed. So I love that cosmic horror element of like
yeah,
that, not knowing. And I thought that
yeah,
was a really fun thing to play with in this book, which was basically giving the universe a little bit of an attitude
yeah,
and saying, yeah,
and
and saying
in
like
much
pushing back.
way, the way the cosmic horror just kind of seeps into the ending reminded me of King's Revival, because it's not a
Yeah,
cosmic horror novel throughout, but at the end, boy, does it get cosmic at the end of that one. And
yeah.
yeah,
King kind of took a swing there at the end.
yeah, yeah, and I like the swing here too. But I also think one of the things about that conversation where Beth is, when Isabella says, he stands right here and all that, is there's this dawning realization with Beth that I hooked into, where I just imagine she knows she's playing, as what's the say, playing dice with the universe, playing dice with
Yeah,
the universe. She knows she's doing that. So there's got to be a moment, when this is happening where she has to be thinking to herself, what have I done? Like, what did I do? And so there's a couple of moments in this book where her best fears of like, you know, like, you know, and the whole what if this was caused by my travel and all that kind of thing. Really good
right.
moments in the book that I really appreciated. Um, and I know I said in my review that this book has kind of got a Matheson feel in the same way that a lot of authors try to feel Lovecraftian, and it's a lot of those scenes where it just comes dripping off the page, and I think that's really good. But where it's very uniquely like a thing that every novelist has the things that make it uniquely them. I think one of the things that you're really good at, Philip, that is one of your strengths, and it's clear that for example, your attention to detail of wanting everything to be right, which I totally get. I wanted The Last Night to Kill Nazis to be able to have happened, except for if the vampire had been there that they hid from us, right? I
Right.
wanted the history to be correct, and in that superpower that you have there is, especially with this book, is that everything feels really tied together throughout, and there's a real strong attention to detail. And people might not think of Boys in the Valley as being the kind of story that's like about attention to detail, but it is very much an attention to detail book. And I guess that's a thing that I'm seeing as sensing is a part of what makes a Philip Fracassi book is the attention to detail and the tying together of all these things.
Yeah, thank you for that's very nice. Here, I think a lot of that comes from my screenwriting experience, and
Mm-hmm.
in screenwriting, you can't waste a scene. Every scene in the script has to be there for a reason. It has to provide information, create tension. There has to be a reason for it to exist. And sometimes when I read novels, sometimes I feel like it's a little superfluous. Like it just feels like, oh, I had a cool idea, so I'm writing this whole thing about it. And there are set pieces. There are like this is just for fun. I'm not saying that, but I think when it comes to like Boys in the Valley or any of my novels, Serafina, time travel, yeah, I definitely want every scene to have every chapter in this case to have to have a reason to be there. And if it's not providing anything to the reader, then I don't want the scene to be there. And I think that comes, and also to your point, if if everything has to have a because everything has to have a reason to exist, everything has to tie together neatly, and that can be a lot of hard work to do. You have to kind of a lot of that's done in the revisions is to make sure like, well, does this make sense? This is is this following story logic? And it's something like Third World Time Travel where there's a lot of the story logic is very broad and complex. There's a lot of different things going on. You wanted to make sure that you're adhering to everything that you've already created. And that moment, um, I love that moment as well because the moment I'll describe it because it was a pivotal moment for a couple of reasons. The moment I'm describing or talking about is when it's when the reporter says, "Did you ever stop to think that some of the traumatic events you're traveling to are traumatic events because you traveled to them?" And Beth, at least consciously, had not really thought of that. And the reason I like that moment was because one, it's terrifying because
Yeah.
if you read the novel, the events that Beth is traveling to, are literally these horrible moments where people she loves are dying horribly, and the very idea that she would be the cause of that because she's traveling is probably too much for her to comprehend. But the other thing about it, the horror of that, but the other thing about that moment that's critical is it really exemplifies Beth's drive of she's so driven to win, to make this work, to beat the corporate overlord and to be, that she loses sight of a lot of things that are more important. And it's later in the story where she realizes, I don't care about the machine. I just need to get my daughter back. And and she knows by doing breaking in and doing what she's going to do, she'll probably never see the machine again. But so that plays it all plays into her arc of like going
Mhm.
from like I don't care about anything but the technology to slowly over the course of the book at the end, not realizing that like not the technology is not the most important thing in her life.
Now,
So that's part of that arc. Yeah.
and this is partially my memory and having read it about 4 months ago, but the the rules are kind of ones they imposed necessarily. They weren't necessarily like physical laws, or they kind of are. But tell me about how how you thought about them, about the rules being broken, because it's the idea of saying like, and it says it on the back cover, these rules cannot be broken. Well, obviously they get broken, but that's what you come down to, the whole idea of we don't fully understand the cosmos. We think we know the rules, but we see all the time, like especially when they start observing, like for forever we thought solar systems were all going to be organized the way ours are, right? And
Right.
then they
Right. Right.
started looking, and it's like our solar system is very weird. There's a bazillion different ways that stars gather planets, right?
Yeah.
And once we knew that, and so what I thought really is the rules, I knew the rules were going to be broken. It's just like right there, when you say the rules can't be broken on the back cover, I'm like, okay, these rules are going to get broken.
Right.
But you know how soon in the process were you like, okay, this is what's going to happen in the story, and this is how these rules are going to get broken? You understand my question, like what I'm?
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. So that's published that publisher market that's publisher marketing copy, by the way. That's not me. But
Yeah,
I do appreciate that they're creating that kind of like wall of tension, but that we're gonna
yeah.
break through. But I would say this, one of the scenes I had when I first came up with this idea, a lot of times when I come up with a new idea and I'm beginning to flesh it out in my head, building the characters and kind of setting it up and how is it gonna work and what does this world look like and all that kind of stuff. Um, when I'm doing that part of the process, which is all internal, um, usually there's a couple scenes that pop into my head, a couple key scenes, and those scenes are building blocks for the rest of the story. And one of the key scenes that popped up in my head, there are two. I'll tell you both of them. One was um, Beth traveling back to the night that her husband died, and having to watch him relive that moment right before he walks into the elevator um, to get into a car where he's going to ultimately be killed, and she can't do anything to stop him. And reliving that and being powerless to stop him from doing that was the first scene that came to my head. And I really wanted to write that moment because I can imagine the pain
Mm.
that she's basically screaming inside, and but she can't do anything to stop it. And then to answer your question, the other scene about the rules was um, her deathbed scene where I wanted there to be um, because I wanted there to be a breaking of the rule about she can only travel to points in her previous lifeline, uh, and she ends up traveling forward, which is impossible based on my rules that I've established in the book and the science that I've established in the book. It's impossible to travel forward, and she ends up traveling to her own deathbed. Um, and that's where I said, okay, so I'm going to try to break these rules to tell this story correctly. And so that was probably the moment where I first thought about like the rules were meant to be broken. And and then everything else kind of came after that. Like how do what happens after the idea of being with Beth as she died and slipping into the afterlife was something that I was very excited to write about. So that was the moment where I knew I had to like
Well, there's
establish some rules and then break those rules.
well, first of all, you get the get out of jail free card is the fact that we don't fully understand how the universe works. One, and two, I wondered when I was reading it if her mind isn't kind of opened up to these things, and she
Right.
can't really pull herself forward from the future because she is the time machine, right? And how
Right.
much of that is residual, and does that wormhole kind of like attach itself to her in some strange way? I mean,
Right.
those are all speculative angles, and those are all like writer tricks, but like those were things I thought about when I was reading that. So,
Yeah.
you know.
And there's a moment in the book where the question is asked during one of the travel sessions. The question is asked, what would happen if we were to not get if the machine were to fail while the traveler was traveling
Yeah.
during that 90-second window? And the answer was, we have no idea. Then
Yeah.
at the end of the book, when she, during the big, the big confrontation with Jim and the security guards and everybody, and Beth's in the machine, the machine is, destroyed. It's the controls are literally shot along with Tariq. So the idea is that she's basically untethered from this reality because of that. So that kind of, in a way, it's sort of like the scissors snipping the astral projection. It's like she's sort of released into uh, this supernatural ether, that of consciousness, and that's why she is able to see her death, and why she's able to see Coulson, and why she is finally able to like travel freely through time, and she's been untethered from this reality because the machine broke down while her consciousness was traveling.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well,
So
and
I try to set that up early by saying, geez, what would happen if this happened? And then that's what happens. Yeah.
yeah, well, and what's interesting too for me was I read this. Well, for one thing, anytime I read a new science fiction or a modern science fiction novel, my dickheads out there, because I do the Dickheads podcast, always ask me, well, is it Dickian? Is this, and I personally don't think this book is very Phil Dickian. For one reason is that he never worried about the science on a real level.
Right.
Like, but one scene that did feel very Dickian to me was the questionnaire thing, like
Right.
the yeah, because I feel like Dick loved to write scenes about kind of bureaucratic like steps and, and things like that. And I got a chuckle out of that whole like, well, we got to repeat these and we got to see, we got to do this every time. And
Right.
so, and I did really appreciate that one. Now it's funny too, because I had recently read David Gerald's The Man Who Folded Himself. I don't know if are you familiar with that one?
No,
Okay.
I haven't heard of it.
Yeah. So that's a very interesting time travel novel. Again, he doesn't, that's not a science one. That's more of a surreal one.
Right.
But but it was funny because I read them pretty close to each other. So and what's funny is because I kept thinking about, because Gerald was really going for the surreal aspect of like what would it mean to travel through time in a surreal way, and what you were doing was a very scientific approach, and I read them like 2 weeks apart. So
Hmm.
it kind of, and it was interesting to kind of contrast that in my mind, but I think all approaches are valid when if you're experimenting with time travel in a novel, like time travel is a method to, just like the ghost story, it's a metaphor that you can use for telling stories that straight genre or straight novels can't, you know.
Right.
And what is excellent about this novel is that you took the gee whiz of the idea that you wanted to do, which was play with this method of time travel, and found an emotional core to drive the stake into the heart of the readers with. And
Yeah.
so that's one of the things that I think is really good about it. Is there anything in spoilers that you've been dying to talk about? Um, like that you've had to kind of keep inside because the book wasn't out yet, but now we're having this spoiler conversation. Is there something I missed that you're just like, man, I've really wanted to talk about that?
Um, the thing that the one thing that I'm really proud of in the book is the and this is it's a weird thing for an author to say, like, the part of my book I'm most proud of, but we like our own books too, but
Yeah,
is
of
but
course
I
we do.
like I the ending, is because one of the things that was really fun to play with was the idea, and there's a really creepy scene in the book where Beth talks about sitting at dinner, like I think it's an anniversary dinner with Colson, and she can see, because she knows what to look for. She can see his eyes are sort of uh are fluttering like a shutter, with that shutter effect that happens when you travel. And she's like, and the fact that she knew and real in real time that he was traveling was like bizarre to her, because it meant he was traveling from a point in the future. And um and so at the end of the book, one of the things I was really trying to get across was that you're not necessarily, I mean, it's kind of open to interpretation, but you're not necessarily in Beth's story anymore. You're kind of in Colson's story at the end. And Colson this whole time has been sort of in the shadows, trying to get his life back, trying to get, basically, it's just like Beth is trying to save her daughter. Colson is, from the get, the reason he's doing all those and so that when you hear about, if you really construct it, when I'm describing to the reader, like, oh, Colson kept traveling and traveling until the day he died. He was and him and Tariq were doing it in secret. The idea was that he actually did get back to where the timeline he wanted to, which was, and so which was that he's with Beth and his daughter in his kitchen on the day he died, and he knew he was going to die, and he also managed to figure out how to change the past, and therefore change the future. And so that scene to me was so pivotal, because I was kind of dropping little hints all throughout the whole book, that the book at the end of the book, it's going to flip to Colson's story. Beth's story basically ends when she walks into the white, as it were, out of the space meadow. He's kind of like, you can choose your own reality. Just think about what you want and go. And then you kind of don't know what happens to Beth after that. But then when she wakes up in bed and Colson's there, you're kind of switched over to Colson's reality. So it's kind of that moment, I think, was like, I really worked hard to nail that moment, and more frankly, to earn that moment by having all this stuff that I seeded in throughout the whole rest of the book until that point. So that's the part of the story that I really like talking about, because I think it's a lot of it was very fulfilling to it's always fulfilling to, like, as a writer, to feel like everything that happened at the end of that book was earned, and it totally kind of changes the dynamic of everything you just read. um is a really is a was very difficult to do that. So I'm very
Right.
happy that it worked out that way. And it's kind of interesting to me, because I've read some early reviews of the book, and normally when I read early reviews of my books, there's usually a pretty consistent theme to things that people liked or didn't like, you know, but not necessarily like everyone has the same opinion, but if it's like someone who hasn't read a lot of horror, they tend to like not necessarily like the hard horror stuff, or somebody that likes more prosy, dense books, they feel like it was too short. And if people like stuff that's more like action packed, stuff, they feel like it's too boring. So but it's always like a consistent response that I get to my books. But what was interesting about this book was I saw, like, a lot of the early reviews, is everyone seemed to have a completely different take on the story, which I thought was really fascinating. And I don't know
Yeah.
if it's because it's my first science fiction book, and so there's kind of like a mixture of like sci-fi people reading it and horror people reading it, and they're all kind of having different interpretations. But it's weird to, like, for me, it was very like jarring to have people read the book and review it and say, like, the ending was so ambiguous, or the ending made no sense, because it's like, I think if you were actually really, if you were really paying attention, it's actually it kind of like lands on both feet. It's exactly what the whole book is about. Um,
Well, I
but I
mean, I look at
understand that
I
people.
I look at Mulholland Drive or Three Stigmata of Palmer Eldridge by PKD. The first time I saw Mulholland Drive, it made no sense to me. The second time I saw it, I felt like an idiot because it was all there and I didn't catch it. And with Three Stigmata, the PKD novel, like the first time I read it, I was just, there was so much weird stuff flying at me. I didn't catch it.
Right.
And now I'm like, oh my God, I see all the levels it's working on, but it's, so sometimes I think you've got a lot of really incredible ideas in this novel. And I think some people just are they're going to miss some of it, but I don't
Yeah,
think you
and
feel
it's
too
an
bad
interest.
about that.
No, I don't feel bad about it at all. I look, if you line 100 people up to look at a piece of art, everyone's going to have a different opinion of that piece of art. So it doesn't bother me in the slightest when people don't like my work or don't connect with my work, because I know there's going to be a lot of people who do. So,
Yeah.
but
Well,
I find it interesting, and I think with this book in particular, because some people were like, "There's too much science," like it was the science was stuff was so boring, and some people were like, "There's no science in this book at all." And it's all like, so why is it called science fiction? And then there's other people who are like, so it's like all over the place. So I think it's really fascinating because I
yeah,
think it's
I
how
see what
people
you're saying.
approach it. Yeah. And other
Yeah.
people are like, this book is so slow, I couldn't get through it. And other people are like, oh my God, I couldn't stop turning the pages. And it's and it's always fascinating to me how the human mind works. And a lot of it has to do with like, what you connect with. And this isn't something that you connect with, which is fine. Like I said, it's that 100 people in a line to look at a piece of art. I always think of my books that way. Every single person is going to have a different take on that
Well,
piece of art, you know. So, but I thought it was interesting how varied and how widely divergent, some of the early reviews were.
yeah, Ray Naylor had the experience on Mountain in the Sea that when it came out, when it came
Which
out,
I have to read. I have to read. I heard it's great.
it
I just
is
have to
great.
find time. I'm
It
all I
was
do is
my
blur
top
books, so I
read.
never get to read anything new.
Yeah, it was my top read a couple of years ago.
Okay.
But when it
I have
first,
a signed hardcover downstairs, so I might pick it up.
yeah, you should. When it first came out, everyone was talking about the octopus intelligence part of it. And then a couple months later, in which Ray will tell you is his favorite aspect of it, but there's a subplot about AI in it. And then
Hmm.
now he's getting invited to all these artificial intelligence conferences, and everyone wants to talk
Right.
about the AI stuff. But the thing that everyone was interested in the beginning, I'm like the only person that asks him questions about the octopuses anymore.
Right.
And like he we talked about it in the last interview I did with him where he was like, yeah, it changed completely, like the conversation of
Hmm.
this book between when the first couple months that it was out and later. And
Yeah.
I'm interested to see, because all these different people are having this different reaction to third world time travel. If you have that experience too, where where like different events, you'll have different people asking you questions that are totally left field of each other in this on this really fantastic book about that does bring new aspects to time travel. And it's one of the reasons why I'm 100% behind promoting this book. I
Yeah. Okay. Can I say one other thing before I forget?
Sure.
Because you mentioned, is there part of the science that I would like to discuss, and you might find this interesting, is the because one of the things that I explore in this book that as far as I know, I'm probably wrong. I'm most likely wrong. But as far as I know, I'll say this: most of the science time travel books that I've read don't really, or movies that I've seen don't really get into this. But the question of the butterfly effect and the question of the butterfly effect affecting the future, right?
Yeah.
But most people don't get into, like, okay, on Earth, but what happens in the rest of the universe? Like, if you screw something up on Earth's timeline, are you just screwing up Earth, or are you screwing up Mars? Are you screwing up a galaxy 10 billion miles away? And one of the things I wanted to explore in this book was like, why isn't why if you step on the butterfly here on Earth, why aren't you killing a million Martians? Because
Yeah.
technically that's the idea, right? It's not like, why would it just be on Earth? You're changing time. It's universal.
Yeah.
So you're changing reality as it exists, like throughout the universe. It's not just what's happening. Not just You're not just changing your life. So I thought that was really fascinating. So one of the things I did when I was working with I was talking with Les Johnson, who's a science fiction writer, and also he works at he's a physicist at NASA. He's the guy who does the he's in charge of the whenever you watch a movie about a rocket ship and it has those like giant solar sails that fan
Yeah.
out and the sun powers the ship. He's in charge of the solar sails at NASA. That's who he is. And so he's a very smart guy and he's a very good writer. But anyway, he and I talked through that element a little bit. And he was like, it always bothers me when people don't address the fact that if you change something on Earth, it's not affecting stuff um, a galaxy away. And one of the things that we talked about was the inverse square law and how there is how the effect of what you do is strongest at its like a nuclear explosion. It's strongest at its core, but then as it passes through through space, like it dilutes slowly and slowly until the further and further away it gets. And so the idea was that the things that they were impacting on Earth were diluting at a certain point, and the idea is before they got to the moon, that how far they was basically diluted to nothing. The effect was diluted to nothing, which is why the moon-based servers that Tariq has hidden away become such a big element of why he could still show Beth the videos of Coulson before reality changed on Earth.
Yeah.
Anyway,
Well, I
that
think
was a fascinating thing for me to play with during the satellites and the questions and answers with that whole inverse square law thing.
right. Well, there's a PKD story that does play with what you think is like stuff being changed on a mass scale similar to that, but what the twist of the story, you find out that the entire world is inside a bubble, and it's this kid's toy where he's making a world inside the bubble. And at first you think that the universe is bringing these forces down on the world, and then you find out, well, yeah, it is, but it's just because this boy has a toy that's called a bubble where he's got a world in it. And
Yeah,
yeah, it's called The Trouble with Bubbles. It's a 1952 story. So
it's very. I wonder if that's where Stephen King got his ending for Under the Dome.
yeah. Well, I've never seen any evidence that King likes PKD. He
I
never
haven't
talks about
either.
PKD.
I don't think
And
he's a big science fiction guy. I've never heard of him
well,
talking
no,
about it. Has he?
he talks about Clifford Samac a lot.
Oh, he
Um,
does. Okay.
yeah, being influenced by Samac. And well, it's funny because we just did a podcast. We did an episode of the Science Fiction Hall of Fame series on Murray Leinster. And I talked about how Murray Leinster's biggest impact into he's well known science fiction writer. He was very popular in the 1920s. He was one of the earliest science fiction writers, but he's kind of lost to history. But his biggest impact was in 1960, he wrote a novel called The Wailing Asteroid.
Hmm.
And it was so bad that Stephen King threw it down and was like, I could do better than that.
Hmm.
Murray Leinster's influence could
Funny.
be that in on writing, Stephen King mentions, he doesn't say the name of it, but he says it was about an asteroid. And
Right.
in 1960, he wrote a novel called The Wailing Asteroid, and Murray Leinster did. And so Murray Leinster's biggest impact was writing a novel that Stephen King thought was so bad he could do better.
Yeah. I will admit to have had. I will admit that I've had similar influences where I've read a novel and I've been like, it's been almost inspiring because it's so bad. And it's
Yeah.
like, and a lot of times those are like
Oh,
mass
I'll straight
market.
up
Not,
say, I mean, Gary Brandoner for me. Like, I couldn't believe when I read The Howling. I was like, what is this?
yeah.
And
It's
and
funny
and
when you read
and
like a Random House novel that's like on the bestseller list and you're like, this is so bad that
exactly.
I'm now like extra motivated to write something else that catches because
Now, and
I
I
know
should
it's
say
better
that
than this.
Gary Brandoner did, I think Cameron's Closet was pretty good. So he did write ones that were better, but I have a
Mhm.
very distinct memory when I was a kid of reading Gary Brandoner, The Howling, and being like, this is almost unreadable. Like, this is, and yeah, no. And Murray Leinster wrote, and King did say that he was uneven, that he had read Murray Leinster that he liked, but this
Yeah.
particular one was bad. And Murray Leinster, don't throw shade on him. He created the term first contact. He wrote
Hmm.
one of the best first contact stories in the 40s. He wrote The Runaway Skyscraper about a time traveling building in 1920. Very influential. So I
Mm.
think Murray Leinster's history is fine, but if he inspired the world's best-selling author to write, you
Yeah.
know, hey, that's cool. Um,
Yeah.
you know,
Yeah.
that's
I
an
would imagine,
impact.
it's funny because I would imagine Orbit, who published Third World Time Travel, they were interested in maybe a second science fiction novel if I ever write another science fiction novel. And I remember thinking at the time, it's like, man, I don't want to write a, I don't necessarily want to focus on writing science fiction novels, not because that would be very hard to be consistently good, I think, writing science fiction novels because there's just a lot of I don't know. It's just, first of all you're limiting. One of the reasons one of the reasons I really like writing horror is I can do anything I want.
Yeah.
There are no rules. As Stephen King has evidenced over time and time again with giant spiders and aliens and cosmic turtles. But whereas science fiction, you kind of have to play by the rules, and I don't like playing by the rules with my stories.
Mm, I
Well, no,
think
I'm
Philip
actually
K. Dick
interested.
would disagree with you.
Well, I'm interested in what you think about that because that's the way I think. I guess there's different kinds of science fiction. Like
Well, if you write
one
science,
reviewer said this isn't science fiction. This is this is like fantasy, and I'm like,
oh, that's bullshit. That's bullshit.
so
It's
yeah,
not a dark
and I don't
fantasy.
know because I'm not really I'm not as big a science fiction guy as you are. So I am curious as to what your take on that is.
Well, my take on that is, first of all, the Third World of Time Travel is very much a science fiction novel. The call it dark fantasy, that's bullshit. But I mean, I get in this argument all the time with Jeff Burke, my old editor at Deadite, because he wants to narrow horror down into the most like only this is horror and this
Right.
very small window. And I'm a believer of like blowing everything up. Look, my favorite era of science fiction is the new wave. And the new wave with your Harlan Ellison, your John Bruners, your Philip K. Dick, your Ursula Le Guin's, they were expanding the idea of science fiction. Your golden age was all rocket ships and
Right.
high powers and Supermen and all that. And then the new wave was very influenced by being psychedelic and surreal and all that. And is Kurt Vonnegut Sirens of Titan a science fiction novel? Well, of course it is. It's speculative, it's science fiction, but it's nothing like the Third World of Time Travel, right? But Third World of Time Travel is very much like I would compare it to on a science scale, like something like Greg Bear's Blood Music, right? And Blood Music could be called a horror novel as well.
Hmm.
Um, and it's one of Cody Goodfellow's favorites too, by the way, Blood Music. And Blood Music is one that when somebody was asking me for a comp for Third World Time Travel, I said it's not as apocalyptic as Blood Music, but its attention to detail on the science is very similar to Blood Music.
Hmm.
And part of Blood Music is this horror, the main character knowing so much about the universe that it kind of drives them mad, right?
Yeah.
And so that story had to take the science seriously, right? And I think Greg Bear was a physicist too.
Yeah. He is or
Yeah,
was.
yeah.
Yeah.
So he so you can do it that way. You can be Kim Stanley Robinson and write best-selling novels about climate change that take the science very seriously. Or
Right.
he even wrote Aurora, which is a generation ship novel that takes the science so seriously that and this is a bit of a spoiler, but that that the twist or the point of Aurora is that there is no other planet you can go to. They end up coming home. They end up coming
Right.
back to
Right. Right.
Earth. And so you can do it that way, but you can also do it the Philip K. Dick way, where you can write about an alien creature that hides in lichen and becomes a drug that people become addicted to as a form of alien invasion. Three Stigmata of Palmer Eldridge.
Yeah.
Right? That's surreal as shit. And also, by the way, a horror novel completely, right? Science fiction horror novel. And he
Yeah.
also wrote Counter Clock World, which is about time going backwards on a world. Does the novel make a ton of sense? No.
Right.
But
Yeah, so like I have a novel, so I have a novel that I'm working on. I haven't started writing it yet, but I'm working on it in the sense of putting the building blocks together, and it's an alien invasion novel,
mhm.
but it's also I don't know, but in my mind, it's a horror novel because of the way I'm going to write it, but the way I'm thinking about it. But I'm wondering, it's like, but there is part of it because I was talking to a publisher who I won't name, but and they were like, if you ever have another science fiction novel, we'd love to publish it as a deluxe edition. And I was like, um, I said, well, I have this novel that I'm going to be writing probably later this year. That's an alien invasion novel, but I'm not. I always thought of it as being horror, but now that I'm thinking about it, I'm like, well, shit, maybe it's science fiction. I
But it
don't
is
really
science
know.
fiction. It's got, well, and look, I'm like I said, I'm a
Well,
big tent.
it's a very contained alien invasion novel. I mean, you actually don't know, this is a huge spoiler. I'm sorry, everybody. You actually don't know it's an alien invasion novel till like more than halfway through the book. And so it all takes place in one place.
Well,
When
most
one,
people don't realize that Three Stigmata of Palmer Eldridge is an alien invasion novel till the third time they read it.
yeah.
Um,
So yeah, it's interesting though, because I'm actually debating, I'm wondering, yeah, I wonder if this would actually sell as science fiction, but
yeah, well,
hmm.
I honestly, I did not catch the alien invasion aspects of Three Stigmata the first two times I read it. And
It was just like a surrealist novel.
yeah, it's very surreal, but well, a lot of people, they think that novel is just about a bad trip, right?
Right.
Well, it is, but there's also much more going on. But what I would say to you that there's just like horror, there's various colors of the rainbow. It's that's the same.
Yeah.
It's
I
the
wonder how
same.
much of it is based on the name of the because Philip K. Dick had such a reputation at that point, for being a science fiction writer that he was a science fiction writer pretty much no matter what he did. And Stephen King is probably always going to be horror, even though Stephen King says time and time again, some of the books like I think he
Mhm.
like Dolores Claiborne or whatever, he's like, it's not horror, but they call it horror because it's Stephen King. So it's interesting to me because sometimes I'm like, maybe it's just because I'm wearing the horror hat, it would just be horrible. I guess it's also who you sell it to, and I mean, I don't worry about it. I'm not going to change the novel one way or the other. The story is going to be the story,
Mhm.
but I'm interested as to whoever ends up buying it. Knock on wood, somebody ends up buying it, that if they would see it more as science fiction versus horror. I guess I'll probably know more when I actually write it. But
Absolutely, and that
there are
that
some
could
pretty
happen. But
freaky
but
elements in it, so it'd be interesting to
but I would
see.
tell you, like, the very scientific approach, that's a part of science fiction. That's a part of the spectrum. But
Right,
also
right.
the other stuff is too. I mean, Douglas Adams is science fiction, right? And it's hardly
And
comparable to,
that's satire. Yeah,
yeah, it's hardly comparable to Kim Stanley Robinson. And
yeah.
Robert Sheckley was doing the Douglas Adams thing in the 60s before even he did. So
Interesting.
and Ron Goulart was writing very hilarious science fiction in the 60s and 70s. And they were writing comedic science fiction. That's part of it. I mean, the spectrum is the thing. All right,
Yeah.
Philip, this was great talking about the third rule of time travel. I am a huge fan of this novel. I'm really
Thank
glad
you.
we got to talk about it. I I'm good. I will put. I saw you writing down blood music. You
Yeah.
should.
I
Yeah,
also wrote
definitely.
down
I would
Clifford
also say that
Simic.
the Man Who Folded Himself by David Gerald.
Oh yeah,
Again,
that was the other one I wanted to write down. Yeah.
yeah. And the funny thing about that one, I've been trying to get Mallerman to read the Man Who Folded Himself, and for the same reason. The reason why I wanted Mallerman to read the Man Who Folded Himself is that, especially, and I know you are too, like the three of us are all believers in following the rules and staying tight to things. It's one of the reasons why I like Dolores Claiborne, because she never cheats on it's in her voice the whole time. He never leaves her voice because she's being
Mm,
interviewed
right.
and telling the story.
Right.
And one of the things about The Man Who Folded Himself is, and I recommend if you are going on a flight or taking the train somewhere, that I read it all in one sitting. It's 170 pages, and it benefits from one continuous read, The Man Who Folded Himself, because it's one where if you hear the concept, which I won't tell you, if you know the concept, you're like, how the hell did he pull that off without cheating? And
Mm,
then and then and it's a very experimental novel about somebody who gets a belt that causes him to time travel. um
interesting.
yeah, it's a very great book, and I've been telling Mallerman he will go crazy for it because he loves books that don't cheat, of the concepts. And I think you I've
Well,
had that discussion with you. I've had that
if I
discussion with
read
Levin.
it, and enjoy it, I'll double down on bugging Josh about it. Make sure he reads it.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. I've been I keep telling him he's gonna love it because especially after I read Incidents Around the House, I think Josh gets so much credit for not cheating that concept. And because it's almost impossible to read that book without trying to look for like did he mess up on it, and it's so impressive. Levin's the same way too. I know I've talked with Levin about it too.
Yeah,
uh,
yeah. Incidents is a great book.
yeah. So on that note, everybody, I hope you enjoyed this discussion. And um, I'm a big Fracassi fan around here, so I'm sure you'll be back. I will. And if you're in San Diego or around here, I'll see you on March 22nd. And Philip, I'll see you there.
All right, buddy. Thank you so much, David.
Yeah, I'm so bad at saying at ending these things. I'm so bad at it. It's the worst part for me. All right, later,
Yep.
folks.